In this video, we're going to talk about some of the research methods used to study happiness and other positive psychology variables. In positive psychology, there is an inherent subjectiveness to studying these topics. And that's for good reason, because subjective well being is defined based on one's idiosyncratic personal experiences with the world. Subjective well being is, by very definition, subjective. And therefore, surveys or other forms of self report, like interviews, are very, very useful for understanding this subjectivity. If you went to see a movie with friends of yours, and afterward, as you're walking out of the theater, you wanted to know whether they enjoyed the movie, you would probably just ask them, and you would accept the answers they give you. If they told you they liked the movie, you would believe them. It's interesting to me that there's a kind of inherent skepticism that people have about surveys and other self report measures in psychology, given that we would not hold this skepticism in other areas of life. I wonder where this skepticism comes from. I'm also reminded of this tweet by Todd Kashdan, who is a positive psychology researcher on this exact topic. He says, "If I want to know whether you're happy, I'll ask you. I don't need to shove you into an fMRI to observe which brain regions are most activated. I'm consistently underwhelmed by people who believe self reports are inherently worse than behavioral measures." I couldn't agree more. Now, one bit of critical thinking to apply to surveys and other types of self report measures is to consider whether we are asking the right questions. So, here are a few examples of survey items on measures in positive psychology questionnaires. On a 1 to 7 disagree to agree scale, participants are prompted to respond whether they feel they lead a purposeful and meaningful life, whether their social relationships are supportive and rewarding, whether they're engaged and interested in daily activities, and whether they actively contribute to the happiness and well being of others. What do you think? Are these good measures of positive psychology variables? Are these good measures of flourishing or psychological well being? In terms of other methods we might use besides surveys, we could consider health records, which would give us insight into objective outcomes like longevity or disease. We could also use field studies to observe people's behavior in the real world outside of the laboratory. For example, we could stage a car accident on the side of the road to see if other people will stop and help. We could also use physiological measures, such as fMRI, which Dr. Kashdan mentioned in his tweet that I showed you, or skin conductance, or cortisol levels. In terms of research designs, scientists often use what are called correlational methods to study the associations between variables. In such correlational designs, researchers will only measure the variables rather than manipulate them. For example, researchers can measure friendship quality and overall happiness to see if those two variables are correlated. Correlational designs let us know whether there is a meaningful association between variables, and we often use this design when it is either impossible or unethical to manipulate these variables. We can't randomly assign some people to have good or bad friendships to see if it affects their happiness. Now, a correlational design can be very useful, but what are some limitations? We cannot conclude directional causal effects from correlational studies. So, to take our example from the previous slide, if we found a significant correlation between friendship quality and happiness, it could be that people's friendships are causing them to be happier. It could also be true that happiness comes first and causes people to have better friendships. That would be an example of reverse causality. A third option is what are called bidirectional causal mechanisms, where both variables are causing each other. So perhaps friendship causes happiness and happiness causes friendship. A fourth possibility is called the third variable issue, where an unmeasured variable is actually causing both of them. So maybe some genetic component is going to make people happier and also cause them to have better friendships. True experimentation is the only research design that allows us to conclude causality. And the key is using a technique called random assignment. When we randomly assign some participants to one or another group, then we assure that the any difference we observe is not attributable to pre-existing variables. This allows us to determine whether a variable causes a change in another variable. Let's look at an example of experimentation on this slide. To take a different research question, what if we're interested in whether mindfulness meditation causes psychological well-being? We could manipulate the variable of meditation using random assignment. In this case, meditation is the independent variable, the thing that the researchers control and manipulate. And we do this by creating at least two groups with at least one control group. So in this case, the two experimental conditions I have are the meditation group and the control group, which does a similar activity, let's say restful journaling. Which participants will be put into these two experimental groups? Well, it's random, usually determined by a coin flip or a random number generator. By putting participants into these two experimental groups randomly, we assure ourselves that there is no underlying difference that might otherwise explain how one group could outperform another group on the outcome measure. In this case, we would measure the dependent variable, let's say happiness or some other trait associated with psychological well-being. If our meditation group scores higher on this dependent variable than the control group, we know that it must be because of the variable we manipulated as researchers. There's no alternative explanation. Here's a question I often use as a learning check in my courses to test whether students understand the principles of experimentation and the limits of correlational studies. Here's the prompt. For an experiment, I recruit only Johns Hopkins students, then I randomly assign them to either listen to music or scroll through a social media app. Then they complete a positive mood measure. People in the music group score higher. Based on this study, can I conclude that music causes happier mood compared to social media? What do you think? Yes or no? Pause this video and think about it for a minute, then make your choice. Many of my students choose B, no. But if you chose choice A, yes, then you are correct. We can conclude that music causes happier mood compared to social media based on the results of an experiment like this one. Some people get tripped up because in the prompt I said that I was only recruiting JHU students before randomly assigning them. The key here is the phrase random assignments. When I randomly assign people to one of two conditions, then I am essentially conducting a true experiment through which I can conclude causality. The fact that I only use JHU students here is irrelevant. It doesn't matter which people are signing up for the study. Now, if we want to talk about generalizability of the study, it could be that this experimental manipulation really only applies to a subset of college students and not to most people throughout the world. If that is your concern, it's definitely a valid one, but it doesn't have to do with experimentation or causality. This is part of a different concern we would have about whether the results of a study apply to the general population. And in this case, the results may not apply.